Hi, Kevin Coop here, and this is FaceTime with the Content Guy. You know, one of my favorite phrases, in fact, those of you who've been reading Morning Newsbeat for a long time are probably sick and tired of it. But one of my favorite phrases is that, listen, companies need to not just be sources of product for their customers, but also resources of information. And the thing is that, that's rooted in my own personal philosophy of life, if you will. I am a sucker for an educational experience. I just, listen, I always have been. And I think one of the things that gets me up each morning to do Morning Newsbeat is I know I'm going to learn stuff. And that's a tremendously powerful motivator for me. But I do think as the world grows complex and more complex, this is going to be increasingly important to all of us. We're all going to have to learn stuff. And a lot of it's going to be time that it's going to be stuff, not only didn't we know it, we didn't even know we needed to know it. Because that's how fast the world is moving. That's how fast the world is changing. There's stuff out there that many of us thought we would absolutely never have to wrap our heads around. And now, not only do we have to do that, but we really have to come to some kind of fundamental understanding. In some ways, grown to be at peace with things we never thought we'd have to be at peace with. And I have to say, lately, I have found myself learning from some unexpected places. Listen, there seems to be no question, right, that the Bruce Jenner interview on ABC with Diane Sawyer, in which the fact that he now identifies himself as transgender and thinks of himself as a woman was, frankly, it was a transitional moment for a lot of people. Anybody who watched it, it was really, really interesting in terms of how he identifies himself and what his thought and emotional process happens to be. And listen, I'm going to guess that the vast majority of people who saw that interview, they may never have known a transgender person. They may never have known somebody who went through that experience and the emotional ups and downs and the long-term sort of internal emotional suffering that people like that go through as they struggle to be their authentic selves. That's a very difficult thing for a lot of people to deal with in their lives, and it's even difficult for people who are trying to understand it. But understand it we must, because listen, let's face it. And listen, I gotta be honest with you, I'm tired of the whole Kardashian, Jenner, three-ring circus. But in this case, I think there was something valuable. Because let's face it, retailers, businesses, they're gonna have to learn how to deal with this stuff because people who are transgender, who identify themselves differently than other people do, they may be working for you, they may well be your customers, and figuring out how to make those connections and at least show tolerance, understanding, compassion to kind of get it in some basic way is going to be really, really important. Now, it was interesting. A couple of days later, I was watching The Nightly Show. And one of the things that Larry Wilmore did on that show is he actually had a transgender person come on the air. And he basically asked him to define certain terms. And there were some of them were terms I thought I knew, but apparently I didn't, because my understanding of them was somewhat different than the way he explained it. And it was a tremendously valuable lesson, I thought, because sometimes, listen, we don't know the vocabulary, we don't know the definitions, and it's going to be, again, increasingly important for us to understand those things if we're going to kind of exist and function in the world the way it exists today. Now listen, and I was a lot better than the Pinocchio segment that ran for it, which was a little bit tasteless. But the thing is, we have to keep in mind is these are comedy shows, right? And sometimes you have to cut through that stuff to get to the education. And these are the shows that are communicating with young people who are increasingly more tolerant and compassionate and understanding about these things than other people who might be a little older and more rooted in experiences that, that are more familiar to them, if you will. And the other thing is that I was also watching another show. It was interesting, a show called Inside Amy Schumer, also on Comedy Central. And I was watching this episode of this show, and it was really, really interesting. First of all, it's incredibly vulgar, it's incredibly profane, and in some ways, it's incredibly tasteless. It really is. I have to say, and quite frankly, I don't know that I've heard that many poop jokes in like a 3-minute period of time. But that said, on this episode that I happened to watch, and I'd never seen the show before, there was one segment about football and rape that was incredibly funny, as improbable as that seems, but also got a certain essential truths that I thought was really, really educational in its own way, without losing its basic sense of humor. It is, after all, a comedy show. And there was another segment where Amy Schumer actually interviewed another transgender person. And all it made me think is, gee, I wonder if comedians are able to ask questions that the rest of us can't ask, because maybe they have less of a filter on what they're going to say and how they're going to react, and somehow it is more acceptable to them. And then there was a segment which is very, very funny, and it really talked about how women are objectified as sex objects until a certain age, and then once they cross that age, well, then they're sort of marginalized because they're old. And that was, they basically got us some basic essential truths in that segment. And I thought, wow, I just learned something here in terms of how different people see the world differently than I do. And that's always a tremendously valuable lesson. And again, I think the key here is not to practice another phrase that I use a lot here on Morning Newsbeat, epistemic closure, right? You can't always assume the world is the way you see it or the way you'd like it to be. Inevitably, it is not. And it becomes more not like what we think it is almost with every passing day. Listen, I don't care who you are. You have to acknowledge that the world is far more diverse and complex and complicated than you ever thought it would be, and that you have to react to it in a way that is more considered, with greater compassion, with greater tolerance than maybe you ever thought you would have to. Listen, but in the end, I think this is all a good thing, because I'm going to learn stuff, and I'm a sucker for an educational experience. Anyway, that's what's on my mind this Thursday morning, and as always, I want to hear what's on your mind.